Hello and welcome to another TLDR News UK video. The coronavirus pandemic has been utterly destructive to our collective mental and physical health. Staying inside, not being able to see friends, and refraining from hugging loved ones. This also came with serious economic problems too though. In effect, we'd shut down a massive chunk of the economy, and as we start to open things up and restart these sections of the economy, the question on many of our minds is, how the f*** are we going to pay for all of this? One suggestion has been a wealth tax, an idea which was already being floated pre-pandemic, but appears to be getting increasingly popular. So in this video, we'll explain what a wealth tax is, why some people think we need one, and if the idea is actually a good one. Speaking of needing to raise money, running an entirely independent news network which produces a ton of content each week isn't cheap. So if you want to lend us a hand and support our completely independent journalism, then consider backing us on Patreon. Your support not only helps us grow and hire new staff, but it also gets you a bunch of perks, such as early access to videos, your name in videos, exclusive behind the scenes posts, and more. Find out what you can get and sign up by clicking the link in the description. Anyway, before we get to the wealth tax itself, let's first look at the economic situation we're facing right now. The first thing to understand is exactly what the budget deficit is. Put simply, it's when the government spends more than it collects. For example, in 2020-21, the government collected around £791 billion. Its spending, though, was £1,094 billion. As anyone who attended even primary school will know, the government therefore spent more than it had, to the tune of £303 billion, which does make sense considering the chaos of 2020. Regardless, as the government spent more than it collected, it had to borrow the rest. This means that borrowing financed about 28% of public spending, which in reality meant that £1 of every £3.60 of government spending was borrowed. As the graph shows, this deficit is now the largest we've seen since World War II. So how do we fix it? Well, one of the proposed ideas is a wealth tax. As the name suggests, it's a tax on the wealth an individual has. Unlike many other taxes, like sales taxes, income taxes, or capital gains taxes, they're not taxing economic activity, they're just taxing the wealth someone had. So if we implemented a 5% wealth tax on billionaires, then Sir Leonard Blavatnik, the UK's richest man, would owe the government just over £1 billion, while Cameron Mackintosh would owe about £60 million. Such taxes, though, are quite tricky to implement. For example, if this is an annual wealth tax, then many could choose to hide their wealth abroad, or tie their money up in material assets so that they look cash poor. With this in mind, let's take a look at some of the proposed ways of implementing such a tax. Luckily, the London School of Economics has produced a report on exactly this. Firstly, it recommends defining wealth as net wealth, effectively including anything except debts. So businesses, homes, pensions, and financial wealth would all be included. Mortgages, however, would not, as they're debts. Secondly, they recommend introducing such a tax for all UK residents above a certain threshold, which we'll get onto in a second. This includes non-doms and recent emigrants. Thirdly, while the tax can be paid over 5 years, it is a one-off tax, meaning that the tax is on all of the wealth held by an individual at the time the tax is introduced. The Commission claims that if well designed, the wealth tax would be very hard to avoid. For example, tying up money in assets would not help, as they would be taxable as well. This is also the case for emigrants and offshore accounts. So this is the eligibility of LSE's proposed wealth tax. But what exactly would the tax rate be? Well, they haven't actually proposed defined rates of tax for different income levels, but they have provided two examples. The first is a lower threshold. This proposal would mean a wealth tax that has a threshold of £1 million for couples. Any wealth above this will be taxed at 1%. It's estimated by LSE that over 5 years, this could raise £260 billion, which they claim is the equivalent of raising VAT by about 6p. The second example is a higher threshold. This proposal would mean raising the threshold to £4 million for couples. And again, they propose that any wealth possessed above this threshold should be taxed at 1%. And they claim that over 5 years, £80 billion will be collected using this method. So while the first option could almost single-handedly end the deficit, the second one could certainly put a big dent in it. Both of these options could produce positive results, but neither focuses solely on the super rich. This is something that an article in The Times has covered, and covered very well. They've created an interactive slider in their article about wealth tax, which allows us to look at some of the ways it could be implemented on the super rich billionaire class. So exactly how much could be taken from the super rich? Well, let's start off by looking at anyone who has a personal wealth of over £1 billion. This seems like a fair starting point, because if your wealth has more than 9 digits, it's fair to say that you're super rich. If we go back to the lower LSE model, they charged 1% for those earning over £1 million and pulled in $260 billion. A new 1% taxation rate on super rich couples with more than £1 billion would still pull in $4 billion. This would pay for about 10% of the NHS's track and trace programme, and about 1.9% of the cost of running the NHS as a whole. What's really shocking though is that this money would come from only 164 people that qualify for the tax. According to the 2021 Rich List, the person who'd have to pay the most tax would be Sir Leonard Blavatnik. Remember him from earlier? Who has a personal wealth of around £23 billion. As such, he would pay $220 million into this scheme. And bear in mind, this is simply the most that any individual would have to pay in the wealth tax. The other 163 people all would clearly not have to pay as much. Okay, well, it's clear that £4 billion would be useful, but perhaps you want some more. After all, these people have an exceptional amount of money, so let's bump up that tax rate to 10%. Again, we'll keep the threshold at those with more than £1 billion though. If this were the case, then we'd raise a whopping £38 billion. Again, this is only from 164 people, the wealthiest of which, remember Sir Leonard, would have to pay £2.2 billion. Admittedly, this is an absolutely phenomenal tax bill, but the fact that his tax bill, alongside the 163 others in the Triple Comma Club, could pay fully for the track and trace service with a spare billion left over, or fund 17.9% of the yearly cost of the NHS, might make the government feel a bit better about the decision. There is also the option of progressive tax policies, and you can model these on the Times' website too, but for the sake of time, we won't run through all of those here, but you're welcome to, there's a link in the description. So that's a brief rundown of the potential ways that we could introduce a wealth tax and exactly how much money could be gained from the different models. And as we can see, there are no downsides. Or are there? Tom Stevenson of Fidelity International shows some potential downsides in relation specifically to the report from LSE. Firstly, although such a tax is designed by LSE to target the right people, he argues that many people in their 50s and 60s who had the good fortune to buy a house many years ago are sitting on a valuable asset. As such, they could be eligible to pay for the tax, despite not necessarily having the available cash to pay for it. He also argues that a wealth tax penalises people who've worked hard to secure their financial security and ensure that they're not a burden on the state in their old age. He claims, therefore, that it's unfair to tax such socially responsible citizens. Lastly, he claims that retrospectively implementing a tax on those who have spent their lifetime saving up would shatter faith in the whole savings framework. Others would argue that we're talking about truly exceptional levels of wealth here, especially when we're talking about those with hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds. Sure, many of those people have worked for their wealth, but the majority inherited a large chunk of the cash, or came from very wealthy backgrounds. Therefore, some would argue that this exceptional wealth, unattainable to the vast majority, ought to be shared, at least a little. But what do you think? Do you think that a wealth tax is fair and could pay for some of the most expensive elements of lockdown? Or do you think it's more trouble than it's worth, shattering faith in savers? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.